Salam alaikum. Good evening and welcome to everybody joining us for this King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies webinar on sustainability in the Gulf post-coronavirus, shifting patterns of consumption in the fashion, food and transportation sectors. My name is Dr. Mark Thompson. I'm Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Unit here at King Faisal Center. And we're delighted to have you join us this evening. Now, to give our webinar this evening some context, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 redefines the kingdom's commitment to sustainability through one of the main pillars of Vision 2030, namely a vibrant society. And this is an initiative that aims to, amongst other things, encourage healthy living and, of course, environmental sustainability, as well as fostering a society that enjoys a rich quality of life and has a strong appreciation for culture. Yet, as we all know too well, the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, or the COVID-19 pandemic, has caused havoc with national economies and societies globally, to the extent that the scale of this disruption and its overall costs to individual governments, societies and communities is at the moment difficult to predict. And indeed, for countless people globally, normal life has already been changed and indeed even overturned in previously unimaginable ways. Now, in Saudi Arabia and the GCC states, one of the sort of consequences of the pandemic and one of the sort of immediate impacts on national economies in the region is that it seems to have begun to change individual and even group consumption habits. So this evening's discussion is going to sort of shed some light on the growing awareness about the burden of overconsumption in the Gulf region, but it's also going to ask whether, in fact, COVID-19 presents an opportunity for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to implement new policies related to sustainability that could provide the foundations for viable transformative change. So to discuss this topic, we have four excellent speakers who are specialists in this field. Firstly, Rawan Makki, who is a PhD researcher in design for sustainability, and she's going to highlight design for sustainability theory and fashion as a case study. Next, we have Intisar Al-Yamani, an independent consultant specializing in communications and public relations, who will talk about the cultural stigma attached to vintage and social media awareness and shifting mindsets. Then we have Dr. Hannah Al-Moabed, who is a research fellow in the Socioeconomics Unit with me here at the King Faisal Center. She's going to discuss the future of food and promoting sustainable consumption through culinary training. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Aisha Al-Sahriri, from the Research Associate at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSARC, who's going to consider whether COVID-19 could facilitate sustainable transport in the GCC states. So Rawan, Intisar, Hannah and Aisha, a very warm welcome to you, and thanks and many thanks for agreeing to participate. So just to let everybody know, for this event, we will have some short presentations from the speakers, and this will be followed by a Q&A session to which you are invited to contribute. And in fact, you can post any questions you have or any comments at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom page. And I will obviously refer to these as we go through the course of the session. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first panelist to speak. And Rawan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for the introduction and for leading on this effort, for putting this event together. I'm really excited to be here with my co-panelists, and thank you to everybody in the audience. We hope you have a really great and engaging event. So I will be speaking on design for sustainability theory, as Mark mentioned, and then I'll be talking about fashion and fashion sustainability as a case study, which is my specialty. So let me just get the presentation up on the screen here. Okay, can everybody see that? Anybody thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great. So I'll just get right into it. I'll give you a really brief background on myself before starting, just so that you have an idea from where I am drawing on this kind of knowledge when it comes to design for sustainability. So I wear two hats currently and for the past years. The first one is that I am a fashion designer of a fashion label that is a sustainable fashion label since 2017. And the second one is that I am a last year PhD researcher in design for sustainability, and my focus is actually sustainable fashion in Bahrain and also the Gulf. So drawing lessons from Bahrain for the Gulf in terms of design for sustainability. A very big part of my research, and to me the most important part of my research as well, is this focus on deriving a definition for sustainability that is really fitting to the region, that is from the region, that is both culturally, economically, and materially relevant to the region. And really that is by not really accepting the sort of given definitions of sustainability that are sometimes from more Western contexts, but really trying to come up with our own definitions there while being within our own material, environmental, and cultural contexts. So these are the two hats that I wear, and I do draw from both my practice and my research. Most of the talk, I would say, is derived from my practice, from my theoretical research into design for sustainability. But in terms of practice, that relates to sort of materials and how things are constructed, how decisions are made. I would say that is also more on the practice side. So happy to sort of engage later on questions or discussions on both. And so just to give a little bit of background on fashion sustainability specifically and what that is, I will be giving a very sort of general idea here because just for the sake of time, and I think some people might have also come across the idea of fashion sustainability before, but there is a lot going on in the world when it comes to fashion sustainability. Some of the main resources out there include a documentary called The True Cost. There's also a group called Fashion Revolution, which focuses on the awareness of the consumer in terms of their environmental and ethical impact. And this campaign has had a lot of success in terms of holding brands accountable, both in terms of environmental footprint, but also ethical standards. And then there's also a lot happening on the academic and policy side, specifically in Europe. So in the UK Parliament for the past 3 years, there's been a back and forth with regards to passing legislation when it comes to environmental standards for brands. And in terms of the sort of more academic side, there's a lot of research that's being pioneered in Scandinavian countries, in Europe, in the UK as well, with regards to both material innovation for fashion, but also with a more systems level framework for fashion sustainability. And we'll talk later when we talk about design for sustainability theory on the difference between something being, sustainable as a product and a system being more sustainable. And then this is sort of more of the practice side. So I think anybody here that maybe is into design or has, tried to make a garment or even a piece of furniture, the supply chain for these things are quite complex. But in the past years, there's been a lot of innovation when it comes to fabrics and trims that are sustainably made. There are now fabric fairs in Europe, in London, that specifically look at sourcing sustainable fabrics and trims. So this is really important because these are the practical steps that need to happen towards having a transition. And we can talk about, that in a Gulf context later as well. So what does it mean if we're importing sustainable fabrics, for example, from Europe? How is that sustainable for us? And I think that's a really important part of the conversation. Now, a little bit more on fashion sustainability globally. The reason that fashion sustainability has become such a big topic over the past years is because when we talk about environmental pollution, it is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It is only second to oil in terms of its impact. And that fact usually needs a second to sink in, because a lot of times we think of fashion as this thing that is packaged in a very attractive way, on television, in advertisements, in shop windows, but really its environmental footprint. And here we're talking across the entire life cycle. So this is from the moment of really agricultural fiber production across the whole value chain towards the actual production, which includes dyeing and finishing, to the actual impact of use, the use stage. So across its life cycle, fashion is one of the most polluting industries in the world. And in fact, it is the second after oil and gas. And then when I mentioned dyeing and finishing earlier, I specifically wanted to point out that stage because they are very chemical intensive stages, and 25%, so 1 in 4 of all chemicals produced globally are actually used for textiles and fashion in the textile and fashion industry. So that's a huge number. Now, a lot of these are toxic chemicals. Some of them are more benign, but just the idea and the mass of industrial, production here is something that is sometimes hard to wrap our heads around. We're all very familiar with oil and how that is a massive production globally, and it is really important to think of fashion and textile production in the same way as a material. And so a lot of these dyes do end up in water sources, which contribute to pollution, not only of the water itself, but of the area surrounding it. And then also 16 out of 27 luxury fashion products, so this is out of a study that was testing actual garments before, after they were sold, but before they're actually washed. But they are tested positive for 1 or more hazardous chemicals. So this is also about our bodies. So, that's kind of the final frontier of everything as well, is that to many people, this can also be a health concern, even though the main problem is really an environmental one. And in terms of why this issue has really come to the forefront, I would say, of the global conversation, there was an instigating event on the ethical side that made it even more important, which was in 2013 in Bangladesh. There was a factory called Rana Plaza, and in one incident, due to a lack of worker safety regulations, the building actually collapsed and more than 1,000 people lost their lives. So because of this issue, this became a really hot topic in the media since 2013. That's when that group Fashion Revolution was created, and this entire momentum has served to put a spotlight on fashion sustainability that is both environmental and ethical because of the workers' conditions globally as well. Now, when we think about the Gulf and our specific context, what are some things that we know about fashion and fashion sustainability? Now, a lot of these things might even be a little bit obvious to people in the audience because they really are about our lived experience. So the first one is that the fashion industry has grown massively in the past 40 years, and the growth of fashion consumption has been parallel to the growth of oil. But all that means is that it's also parallel to the growth of wealth in the region, because it's not necessarily that we have been ramping up production of fashion. It's mainly our consumption, which is really the theme, of tonight, tying in all these different industries, but is also a really important facet of fashion in general, because we are in the Gulf predominantly consumers of fashion as opposed to producers of fashion. So when we talk about fashion sustainability in the Gulf, we really, a lot of the times are talking about consumption, but we will talk about broader definitions in a little bit as well. And so a lot of the themes that come into fashion sustainability in the Gulf include this idea of a post-oil economy, green growth, and post-growth, because the idea here is what happens to our consumption and our production of different goods as we kind of try to diversify from oil. And it's this idea of kind of independence, but also being environmentally friendly and managing that transition in a materially sustainable way. Also in the Gulf, so there's been a lot of change in labor laws in terms of women joining the workforce. Different countries of the Gulf have moved at different speeds, but more or less, there's been a lot of improvement and change in the past decades. When it comes to low-wage labor that is not necessarily national labor, the change in their conditions has been much slower and much more different. And when we talk about fashion sustainability, labor conditions also come into play. So this will be kind of an element to just keep in the back of our minds when we think of the future and when we think of transition. And, you know, as Mark was mentioning earlier, this has been a very challenging year in the midst of coronavirus. Retail has been a segment that has been hit very, very strongly. Fashion sales globally have plummeted. But what's been really interesting for the Gulf in specific, and this was published by a report by the Business of Fashion, as well as McKinsey, I think, reported on this as well. But the actual amount of second-hand luxury purchases in fashion has increased. There's a lot of people that are trying to understand the reasons behind that, because of course there's a price differential, but basically the idea is that fast fashion, which is what we call brands like, you know, Zara, H&M, you know, I mean, in the UK, you have something like Primark. Those sales have really decreased. For luxury, it has decreased, but less. And then for luxury secondhand, it's actually increased. So it's more than doubled. There's a company called The Luxury Closet, which has seen, you know, more than 200% of increase in its revenues. And they're still sort of trying to understand what is really driving that. But it's interesting to see that in this time of crisis where retail has crashed, secondhand luxury sales have actually done better. Some of the ideas behind why this could be is that people are really searching for value, but also they're really kind of looking for service as part of the product. And these companies, because a lot of them are online and they've perfected the customer service model, they're actually really good at knowing how to treat customers online. As opposed to a lot of companies that, you know, are more prevalent, the Zara, H&Ms of the world. In the Middle East region, they haven't really perfected their online offering. So when people stopped going to stores, they stopped ordering from them. So there's a lot that drives, you know, really what's going to survive this wave of coronavirus. But also it comes back to what is sustainable for us in terms of impact on the environment. And I do think online is a really interesting area to explore. I'd be really, you know, eager to discuss this later as well with my co-panelists, because there are pros and cons to sort of online demand as well. So now we're going to talk about design for sustainability theory. So this is really my favorite part, because sustainability has so many different definitions and it's used in so many different ways. And so here we're going to discuss what different people sometimes mean by sustainability, but also kind of at the extent of levels on how, you know, vast this sustainability change can be. So this kind of is a bit of a, I guess, it looks like a bit of a technical diagram, but it's really not. It's quite simple to understand. So if we are looking at the x-axis of this diagram, these are all sustainability solutions. They go from being more insular, which means something that is, you know, just tied to a product. So for example, if this pen were to be sustainably made and the innovation is within this pen, that is insular, as opposed to it being, you know, the entire building that I'm sitting in being more sustainable. And so on the when we go out on the x-axis there, it becomes more systemic, which is the system is more sustainable. Now on the y-axis, we have technology at the bottom and people at the top. So again, going back to the example of the pen, the technology in this pen or the materials might be really sustainably made. But if we're going all the way up to people, what that means is maybe this was produced by a community of socioeconomically disadvantaged people. Maybe it's helping the most marginalized people in our community. So what happens when we read this diagram is when we go from the inside, where we have product, to all the way to the outside, is change becomes more about our systems and more about our people. Whereas on the bottom left-hand corner, the change is about the product. So a lot of products are made in a sustainable way. And what that means is that they're at that first level of design for sustainability. As we go outside or more further out, for example, we have a level called here product service system. And what does this mean? This just means that on top of the product, there are services tied to that product. So if we go to the example of fashion, for example, because that's an area that I guess is very kind of natural and like top of mind for me to talk about, but there is a company called Rent the Runway, for example, that allows consumers to rent really expensive clothing for one night instead of purchasing it. There's also a lot of mobility solutions outside in the world right now that, you know, really focus on services. And this is an area of sustainability because instead of everybody having to contribute materially, they can kind of opt into services. Another really good example here is, for example, creating maintenance contracts for things that don't usually come with maintenance contracts. So this sounds really, radical when we say it, but imagine our clothing was really good quality, and when you bought it, you paid, a little tiny extra amount, and what that meant is that it's serviced for free for the rest of its life. Your clothes will always get fixed. So this is a very simple example, obviously relating to the fashion industry, but it shows how you can add services to a product to actually make it more sustainable. Now, on the spatio-social level, which is the third one, here we start talking more about space, communities, and this might be more relevant later as well when we talk about culinary and kind of food as well, because a lot of the examples of sustainability on the spatio-social level actually relate to complex supply chains, because supply chains also equal actual settlements, communities, space. There are people that live in those areas. So an innovation at this level that I really like actually is this there was a collaboration between the brand Lavazza, which does coffee, like another Costa coffee. They create coffee, an Italian brand, with a bunch of Italian universities. And what they did is that they pioneered using the byproducts from coffee production to actually to use them as inputs in a whole other process that also creates other coffee products and other non-coffee products. Now, this just sounds like interrupting the supply chain, but really what they also did is they went to the communities where coffee are made, and they basically invested in their spaces, in their spatial setup, and the byproduct then and using it became part of settlement and communities. And really that's when we bring space into it, that becomes a different level beyond product and beyond services. Now, at the final level, the socio-technical system level, this is, let's just say, the most, when you think of the future where it's super utopia, it's this technology supporting ideas and things working together. It's that within this realm of ideas. So within a socio-technical system, you could have all of the things that we just talked about, and they are technologically enabled. So society is working at a higher level together to fulfill its needs, technology as well as providing for people, as well as taking space into consideration, taking equity of different groups into consideration. So this is, I guess this is the most technical part, of everything I'm going to talk about, but it's all to say that the definition of sustainability can range from being focused on one product to focused on a society and people and systems. And so there is a big range here in what people mean when they talk about sustainability. And it's important to acknowledge that, because when we get stuck in the product level, it can really limit our thinking. We might think that, my sort of quest or my problem to solve is to make this pen more sustainable, when in reality my problem to solve is to make this this entire village or town that I'm in better off and more technologically advanced, to make the society work in a better way. And so currently the Gulf is more so focused on the product level when you see projects that come up about sustainability. So the most common one is you see a lot of sustainable real estate in the Gulf. And a lot of the times they're talking about the materials, so the blocks, the actual construction being made in a sustainable way. But the impact really sometimes does not spread to communities, in a way that is beyond product level. And to be fair, this is not a criticism of the Gulf, because this is the case almost globally when it comes to sustainability and the sustainability conversation right now. It's just important to put ourselves in context, to know how sustainability is applied in the Gulf. And so, this product framework also has a lighter and more, let's say, philosophical equivalent to it. And what this is that, let's say there's three camps of thinking about design for sustainability. You have, and this is, how in the US you have Republicans and Democrats. This is kind of similar. You have light greens and you have dark greens. So the light greens here, the light greens in sustainability thinking tend to believe that the focus on the consumer, tends to solve the problem. So here, the slogans will be about individual responsibility. In fashion, you always hear the slogan, green is the new black. So that means sustainable fashion, is on trend. It's what people want. And what this really does is that it really encourages consumers to make more active decisions about what they buy. On the dark green end, which is, let's say, another kind of camp of thinking, is this idea of collective responsibility, and that we really need to change a system, because not everybody might afford to opt into sustainability as a consumer preference. And this is actually very prevalent in fashion. So when I've done a lot of my interviews, I've talked to a lot of people that tell me, okay, I'd love to shop more sustainably, but if I had to choose between buying my child one shirt to wear to school, that is made sustainably, as opposed to 5 shirts that are made less sustainably, I will choose the 5. And this becomes, it also becomes this awareness of class, socioeconomic class, what people can afford. And this is where dark greens tell you, if we change the system, which means maybe we mandate standards, policies that make it impossible to produce in a way that is not environmentally sustainable. This way, everybody will be producing sustainably. Thus, we don't have to kind of rely on choice and on people being able to afford change. So these are 2 different camps of thinking about things. In the middle, you have the bright greens, which are kind of a more new group, more new way of thinking, which really merge these 2 camps. They believe in this kind of very vast change, but they also believe in making it tech focused and giving the consumer a little bit of choice. So it's kind of a more moderate position. So this is a little bit, and again, in the Gulf, a lot of the thinking tends to be about the consumer, and largely because it is also really hard to change systems in the Gulf. So what ends up happening is this idea that we can vote with our money, So if I want to be more sustainable, I can buy more sustainable, but it's really hard for us to kind of, do anything related to systems change beyond that in a sort of a fast way. And this is where we are now, and it's just kind of good to be honest about these frameworks and what kind of, problems that we're really facing. And so this is just a little bit from my research here. I'm not going to walk through the whole slide just for the sake of time, but just the first 3 bars. So this question that was asked to participants, this was a Delphi study, which was a 2-round expert panel. So there were 16 experts here that were ranged from policymakers in Bahrain to consultants, to business people, to retailers, and then there were also some environmental activists. And the question here was, what are the most important areas to focus on in terms of fashion sustainability? And the highest 3 areas that came out were consumption, which is really the theme of tonight, and then education and awareness. And the idea here is that it's not just awareness about how to recycle or how to buy, but if we could have an education system that taught sustainability in a way that is applied in design, then we would be nations that are leading in terms of production and design that can create sustainability definitions by our own terms. So I'm not just educating, households to buy better. I'm actually educating a whole new generation to think about design and sustainability in a way where they're designing our cities as cities of the future in every way. And then the third one, which I really love because it's just like a nice, practical, real one, which is disposal and reuse systems. And this simply denotes that, we don't have, this is specific to fashion sustainability, but we can actually apply it more generally a little bit too, but we don't have systems that are very advanced in terms of collection, disposal, reuse, and recycling for textiles. I can speak for Bahrain to say, and I know that, the Gulf varies when it comes to this as well, but our, recycling of plastic and paper and metals is also, lower than I would say a lot of maybe more Western economies. So this is just about systems. And to me, I like highlighting these 3 because I think that they're at the heart of the 3 things that really, if we were looking towards sustainable change, we would need to work on in the Gulf and really build. And so it's consumption, and then the education system, awareness of the consumer, and then really setting up that system. When you teach people, you have to also give them the option of where to go, and the system that works with them in terms of being able to recycle and access to these things, which is all part of the system and the offering. So yeah, so that's what I had for you today. I hope that we're good on time, and I really look forward to our discussions later, to hearing my co-panelists. And yeah, I hope that this was useful, and hopefully we'll be having an engaging conversation about it later.
Thank you very much, Rowan, for and for sort of giving us sort of some of the theoretical background as well. So I'd like to move now and like to welcome Intisar Al-Yamani, and if you'd like to continue, Intisar. Intisar, you need to unmute.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just getting my slide together. Can you see it well there? Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, and a special thanks for the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, and also for my fellow panelists. I'm very happy to be here. Sustainability, and especially vintage in relation and in the context of sustainability, and looking at it from a public relations and communications perspective, shifting mindsets through social media. Let's look at here I can get my next slide for you. Which is actually not moving anywhere. Yes. As Rawan said, and a lot of what I'll be discussing is overlapping with what Rawan has been discussing regarding sustainability. The fashion industry is the second largest polluter, unfortunately, and from a consumer perspective, we are excessive consumers. We buy more than we need, and this negatively impacts the environment. And of course, with the COVID-19 crisis, we have become more aware, and our mindset is now shifting to looking at more sustainable options. We need to protect the environment, and we're much more mindful of that. How do we do that? We reduce waste, or in Arabic, what we call tabdhir, and this is ingrained in our culture and society and very much encouraged even as children to avoid tabdhir. So sustainability is not a new concept or term. Recycling, reusing as well, items every day. Sustainability in fashion is a buzzword, and it has been floating around, and it's an issue that has been discussed in various articles. This is an interesting one published in Arab News in 2019. I urge you to take a look at that at your leisure. What is vintage in this context? We know that vintage, apart from being a sustainable option, it's also a lifestyle choice. There is a niche following of of vintage, also as a sustainability option, but more so as a lifestyle where we're very happy to purchase and use in our everyday lives very valuable items of quality. We know this from the auctions of Sotheby's and Christie's. Here I'm referring to clothing specifically. It can be vintage, whereby it's 2 to 3 generations old, a used piece of clothing, accessory, bags, shoes, jewelry, or it could be new, but from a previous generation. There are stigmas attached to vintage. Again, I'm not referring to the niche who have embraced it as a lifestyle, but more mainstream society. As Rawan mentioned the word second-hand to describe items of clothing. It's regarded to be of inferior quality. It's old, it's used. It's not something that I'll be encouraged to purchase and wear and use as something that is functional in my daily life. It's second-hand, and it also has a second-class status. Before we move on to looking at how Saudi would regard vintage in mainstream society, again, we're up against, although Rawan did say that the secondhand is booming in a way, the stigma is there. But before I go on to that, let's look at the concept of generosity. In Arabic, karam, it is rooted in tribal values, in Saudi values, indeed in the Gulf and the Arab world at large. Examples of that: if a guest arrives at your house and your fridge is empty, you would certainly not make him or her a sandwich and a cup of tea. You would definitely get into your car and drive to the nearest butcher's, even if it was a mile away. You would get your lamb and you'd make sure you cook a hearty meal there and then. Another example would be to celebrate anybody's birthday, to acknowledge it. We wouldn't do it with a birthday card. Not that the thought doesn't count, the thought does count, and gestures that are simple are lovely. But in our society, in Saudi society, in Arab society at large, and customs, it is not only the thought that counts, but also the effort and the optimal effort in action that supports this thought. So in this context, we look at vintage, we associate it with stinginess because it is thrifty or too resourceful. Again, we can challenge these conceptions or misconceptions about it in the next slides. Vintage, there are debates on the definition of vintage. Is it 2 to 3 generations, perhaps, or even older? It's definitely a timeless piece. It is something that is pre-loved, it's rare, it has a classical value, and very much so, as I mentioned before, with Christie's and Sotheby's and the auction houses. These are just 2 examples, and what we find in museums and galleries and what is celebrated of quality and value it is usually an investment piece as well. I've put there a slide of a picture of an heirloom in my family. I wear it, my sister wears it, my mother wears it, this beautiful pendant. We wear it on National Day, the National Day of Saudi Arabia, and we are on a rota every year, so we avoid any arguments about who's going to wear it next. If we want to look closely at the narrative of style and fashion, we could visit the Victoria and Albert Museum here in London. These are timeless classics of 20th century and 21st century contemporary clothing made beautifully, and it gives a beautiful example. When travel is more flexible, perhaps anybody interested, I would urge them to visit. How can we shift mindsets, and why would we do it? Through social media. Social media is a tool, but if we look at the 23 million active users on social media from the 34 million population of Saudi Arabia, who spend nearly 3 hours a day on their smartphones on social media, and those who use the internet, the majority are on Instagram, then it would make sense that Instagram as a platform would be suitable for raising awareness of vintage as a sustainable option. We don't want to force anyone, as the British would say. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Vintage isn't. It's not their preference. However, we do want to give people the choice and challenge this misconception about vintage. And also, of course, style and fashion is very aesthetic, and Instagram, because it focuses on the visual and photography, is very suitable. I can say who and how can awareness be raised, and through which means, and who are the people and leaders and drivers of change who are able to do that on social media and celebrate sustainable living. Let's look at social media influencers. And what I mean here by influencers, I want to make it very, very clear, are not the social media influencers who are the models and those who are posting makeup tutorials. These are not who I'm referring to here. These are drivers of change and specialists in their fields who have a large and high percentage of engagement level. And engagement is actually a formula in social media and it's something that is scientific and studied. It has a correlation with the number of followers. However, it's not a cause and effect. So you can have a low number of followership, but your engagement is high, meaning that you are highly influential to driving messages and change to your followers. Who are they? I'll give you 3 examples here. We go back. Okay, I've missed 2 slides. See if I can get them back. Here we are. Thriyan Jeddah, interior designer and motivational speaker. He doesn't work in vintage specifically, but he does call for sustainable options. Again, in Rawan's presentation, we looked at using local materials and raw materials like local stone, for instance, instead of importing marble from Europe. Vintage curator Ray Joseph and the founder of 1954 by Ray Joseph is a very intriguing influencer. She is pioneering vintage in Saudi Arabia, and also she has a very dedicated and loyal niche following. She was very intriguing that I had to talk to her and write about her for an article here that has been published in Arab News. Please do take a look at it at your leisure. With her work, she's onto something very good, because if the closet value or wardrobe value of Saudi Arabia is second to Italy, if this statistic is true, then she's definitely onto something. Shahad Al-Shahel is an entrepreneur, co-founder of Abadia Official, and she has been featured in Forbes. Again, the time doesn't do justice to these influencers' work, and do look them up and take a closer look at their work. But she calls for and encourages hiring of local talent and creatives, and also the preservation of Saudi heritage. A beautiful piece here. She was inspired by the Saudi date pit that she turned into a gold button design on a blouse. And I will try to find out how to get one of those. Also, we can adapt existing models from the West or global model. It launched an environment project that encouraging renting, repairing, and reselling items. I put this slide in. It's no surprise that Arabic is the language distribution on social media in Saudi Arabia. There's no surprise at all, but I'm surprised that it's nearly 100%, 97.9% in fact. And this is something that we need to be very mindful of. If any awareness and call for change or drive for change should be in the Arabic language, I think it should run parallel to the global languages, and especially English. I think they would work together well in driving these messages. This is a slide that is not specifically related to sustainability, but it's related to vintage at its finest, when vintage is royal. I had the pleasure to attend King Faisal's exhibition in London in 2020, just before the lockdown, and had the pleasure and chance to take a photograph of King Faisal's Digla, beautifully embroidered and handmade. The next slide is a timeless piece, a tweed coat Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, has been wearing from the 80s to today. And here we have the diamond fringe tiara, another heirloom in the British royal family, where from Queen Mary to Princess Beatrice, who recently got married, and she was wearing it. And she also wore the Queen's dress. To conclude here, I think this quote is very appropriate and drives this message from this presentation. Is a quote by Al-Jawhara Sadim of Sadim Fashion House. When I design, I think about going from cradle to cradle, as opposed to from cradle to grave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Intisar. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Hannah. So who's going to talk to us about food sustainability? Dr. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Oh, where'd it go? Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Rowan and Intisar, for your presentations, and to the King Faisal Center for hosting us today. I've been excited about this panel, actually, just because I feel like there's so much to talk about in terms of sustainability, and these are very interesting kind of themes to address sustainability that can probably present a lot of things that are very close to our daily lives to make it more relevant, because it's often thought of as a very big term that's not necessarily very accessible to a lot of people. I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of skills for sustainability and the future of food by looking at kind of toward the end of my presentation, kind of how we can shift consumption patterns through culinary training and through chefs. And it kind of talks a little bit about what Rowan had brought up, kind of looking at that idea where when education is brought into it, and when you're changing kind of the ideas that are distributed through kind of your curriculum and through training institutes, things shift a little bit. So I'm going to start with a definition of vocational education and training, only because that's mainly where I focus most of my research. And so I'm going to ask about how vocational education and training contributes to addressing kind of social and environmental challenges, then move a little bit to the main challenges related to sustainability and skills in the food industry, and finally how culinary training can illustrate mechanisms to cultivate skills for a more sustainable future. So the UNESCO kind of defines vocational training as comprising education, training, and skills development relating to a wide range of occupational fields. So when you think of education, there's obviously primary, secondary, and higher education, but skills development is also an incredibly important part of education. And it's more so, you know, when you're actually thinking about practical skills in the workplace, and it's growing kind of globally as a very important part of education that needs to be kind of addressed in terms of looking at skills for the future specifically. And the UNESCO kind of goes on to describe the relationship between TVET, which is technical vocational education and training, and sustainable development, as it's, you know, it's a contributor to empowering individuals, organizations, enterprises, and communities, fostering employment, decent work. I mean, it's putting a lot of the burden onto TVET to really change the way the world works. But it also has this underlying assumption when you read these definitions. And the assumption is that training leads to productivity, leads to economic growth. You know, it assumes that, you know, skills will lead to employability, will lead to jobs. And I think that that is not necessarily the way it always works. And I think it's been a kind of a contested issue. When you talk about the idea of green skills and greening skills, you kind of take a little bit of a kind of focus on how skills can be more than that, just kind of linear assumption of training will lead to work. And I think one of the major issues with the term sustainability, especially in education and skills, is it often, especially if you're thinking about businesses, is defined as continuity. So you're talking about sustainable development, meaning something that's not going to end. However, when you're looking at it from an education perspective in this kind of broader green skills narrative, it's more about training for skills for the future that will not be detrimental to society and the environment. So it is not necessarily the continuity alone, but it's continuity that is not harmful. It's continuity that is progressive, that is actually going to help in terms of using our resources to the greatest ability, so we're not depleting them completely. So I think, you know, there is that kind of tension between the idea of sustainability and sustainable development. And then with businesses specifically versus the individual, again, Roanne brought this up a little bit in the theory part that she was talking about, but the idea of skills being the solution to sustainable development is tricky because skills are embodied in humans, and therefore each individual cannot necessarily end up creating this economic growth that we want them to. Skills are not a thing in of themselves, it's the skills that people have. And so I think that if you kind of refocus and think about how the skills that we're teaching are skills for human development and not only human resource development, then you will develop this base of people who have these skills that are transferable and that are also part of that process of understanding the impact of their skills on the environment that they're working in. So they can act as kind of, I think the humans will act as the skills, but the organizations and government policies do need to kind of work on the regulations so they can act as vehicles through which those skills can be transformative. And, you know, this is kind of starting to come through with international policy and direction. So this is one of the ways the UN Human Development Report talks about the link between work and human development. It's synergistic. It enhances human development by providing incomes and livelihoods, by reducing poverty, and by ensuring equitable growth. Human development, by enhancing health knowledge, skills, and awareness, will then increase human capital development. But I think we need to make that distinction. And for me, humans as capital alone is very tricky because there are a lot of other things that we need to think about when we're teaching people skills. So I do argue that skills and training should focus on the individual. And the capabilities that the individual can gain, because skilling for very narrow jobs has an expiry date on it, especially when you're talking about kind of the future of the way the world is going to look. And instead, if you skill more broadly, people can thrive in a changing and ever challenging world, I think. So with culinary training and sustainability, I'm going to actually gloss over that and go to this slide on green skills in the culinary industry. So the need for greener skills in the culinary industry is imperative because of the role chefs have within the global food system, which is massive and incredibly complex and interconnected. But if trained in concepts of sustainability, chefs are actually that link between that global food system and the individual, because they are using those products and we all are consuming food. So what's you know, kind of wonderful about the culinary sector when talking about sustainability is that everyone eats, and so this is going to really impact everybody. And so when academies, for instance, can incorporate and reorient learning and incorporate sustainable ideals into the training process itself, then the community as a whole will begin to benefit from these, especially if these academies and training institutes with the culinary arts are proliferating and using these types of ideals in the way that we train. We'll all eventually start experiencing some of these and the changes will begin to ripple kind of across the system. Some of the issues that we have to think about in Saudi when we're talking about food sustainability globally, but more specifically to Saudi and the region as a whole, I think it goes far beyond that chef, right? It is the food system. We're talking about our water resources that we need for agricultural production. Agricultural sector is the largest user of water worldwide. So it basically utilizes around 80% on average globally, and up to 90% of the water that's used in Saudi Arabia is used for agriculture. So we're using a lot of water to grow our food. And there have been very interesting innovations in this that have to do with vertical farming, but those are also still very water heavy at the moment. Considering it's predominantly dry climate, this is something that we really need to think about. We're one of the poorest water countries in the world. And it's estimated that at the current rate of withdrawal, we will be out of our non-renewable water within 20 years. The amount of land that's suitable for farming has declined on a global scale by 40% in the last 50 years. And that has a lot to do with farming practices that deplete the topsoil. So a lot of the very industrial big farm production is pesticide heavy. You go in, it's one crop, you destroy the topsoil, you destroy the biodiversity, and there are a lot of innovations that are happening in that space that have to do with, kind of using multiple crops because it does really enrich the soil, but we're not necessarily doing that yet. So there's a push to do more organic farming, less pesticides within the country, and there have been a lot of initiatives to support farmers to go organic, but it's still a very challenging thing because a lot of that technology is not necessarily available to small farmers at the moment. And agriculture can be quite polluting. So that those pesticides do run off into our water sources, which we don't really have a lot of. So it's something that we really do need to think about. And also we import about 80% of our food. So you're thinking about kind of the environmental impact of importing, but also the packaging, the storage, the logistics, and the fact that also we as a country waste more food than anybody else in the world. That's another problem because we're importing, there's a huge environmental impact there. And then we're also wasting a lot of that food. That there's a big environmental impact there. And on top of that, a lot of that just goes directly into landfills. And then there are more greenhouse gases that are emitted, contributing to climate change as well. So the food waste is not just an issue of Tabdir, but it really is an issue on a much bigger scale. And I think that it's estimated, the Ministry of Environment, Water and Agriculture estimates that it also costs the kingdom about $13 billion US annually. So there is, I think, a silver lining. I mean, I think that we have a lot of opportunities. For one, the introduction of this panel was on kind of the vision and the quality of life program. And so I think we are bringing a lot of these issues to the surface that we haven't necessarily been addressing in the past. In the past, when we talk about food security, we made some policy choices that have actually depleted our water resources. So there's been a shift now to look at how we can be more innovative and use our resources to make sure that food is going to be sustainable. Some of that has to do with planting abroad and importing some of that food. But we do need to remember that food is a global system, and therefore we need to think about it on a global level. And we need to think about kind of just how we can find pioneers within these different kind of agriculture, water, and environment sectors, as well as now, as I'm going to show briefly, in the culinary sector. So as of February of this year, there's been the Culinary Arts Authorities was launched within the Ministry of Culture. And so I believe that just having that regulatory body there can really empower the culinary sector, which is coming kind of from the ground up in terms of developing that talent within the country, to really ensure that these ideals and principles are incorporated into the curriculum. So culinary skills for sustainability, there's so much that I could talk about, but I'm going to highlight a couple of ideas. So the first thing, as a chef, one of the most important things to do is kind of learn how to do the stakeholder mapping, which is very complex. And so you think about, the impact of the ingredients that you're going to be using within your menu items on the environment and on society. What are the health implications for using these ingredients on the consumer? Do they help solve some of the health issues, the public health issues that we have within the country or not? Does it make more sense environmentally to import this product or to grow it locally? Who's growing it locally? Are they doing it well? If not, can I talk to farmers who might be able to do it better? You know, I think it's another question is it a necessary ingredient? Can I take it off the menu completely? Can I reduce it? I mean, I do not think it's culturally relevant to eliminate meat from our diets, but I also think that we don't necessarily need to be consuming it at the same level that we have been considering the environmental impact of meat on the globe. So I mean, there are a lot of initiatives that have worked in other contexts that we could look at how we can adapt to our context. So, you know, a meat-free day of the week, or 1 month a year, like Veganuary here in the UK, which has taken off and is apparently has people from almost every country in the world participating in it, which is, you know, not necessarily relevant. But I think that talking about kind of ways chefs can encourage different eating habits through understanding who's being impacted through their menu items is something really important. A second, and one last thing that I just wanted to mention about the stakeholder mapping is that teaches a very important skill of critical thinking. And that is a very transferable skill and a very necessary one in a place and in a world that is shifting very quickly. The second issue I want to talk about was traceability, which I saw on Rowan's graph way at the end. So people are not thinking of it as a very important aspect of sustainability, at least in the fashion industry. I think it's gaining a lot of traction in the culinary world and in the kind of actually the food system world as well. So traceability is this idea that you can find out where your product came from and think about all of the different kind of stops it has to make on the way. And it's similar to the stakeholder mapping, but then you're zoning in on individual ingredients. And to do this, companies are using a lot of software. So in that, you are gaining a lot of ICT skills, which are very necessary in the world that we're living in today. But at the same time, you're again using that critical eye in terms of evaluating what impacts your ingredients are having. You can consider things like the water footprint of your ingredients, things like the soil footprint. You can think about things that have to do with the cultural relevance of those ingredients in your context and in your restaurant, in your kitchen. Food waste. So this is an image that I've seen so many times. I stole it off of the internet, I'm sorry, because I can't find a source for it, but I've seen variations of it. And this is one of those images where people look at it and they think, oh my goodness. But it's taking generosity that Intisar brought up to the extreme. And I do not necessarily think that this is something that any of us would recognize as a positive thing, but it is. And with our celebrations, the way we want to show our generosity, we are making some very big mistakes in terms of our food consumption. Current organizations exist. For instance, you have the organizations will come and will repackage food that hasn't been touched and redistribute it. But the thing is, they won't touch something like this because somebody has already contaminated it. So what chefs can do in terms of food waste management is A, control portion size, but also B, think about the idea of using all the ingredients that you are using in your kitchen. So, you know, once this is used, you're not going to be able to go through and pick out the rice and the meat to use it for something else, most likely. But that's when we need to think about the idea of composting. And it needs to be done. There's been incredibly successful compost stories in very hot climates. And there have been interesting compost success stories with working specifically with commercial kitchens. So using that compost, and the great thing about compost, which is turning organic matter into fertilizer, is then you have more fertilizer for your soil, which we have an issue with in terms of the salinity of the soil and the depletion. So, you know, kind of understanding how we can use food waste in a more productive way is one thing. But also within the kitchen, when you're using the ingredients, food waste can be controlled by thinking about making soups and stocks out of the material that you're not yet necessarily using. And that's another skill in terms of thinking about the broader impact of what you're doing, but also you are addressing a social dimension as well as an environmental one. in that one. And the last skill that I want to talk about is kind of harnessing communications and technology. So a lot of this is an example of, using technology within the farming industry. And there's a smartphone behind the little communications and technology bubble right there. But it's a lot of farmers are more and more linked up to vendors, and that way they can get their products kind of without going through the massive global food system, which is actually a lot of times really marginalizing people who are using these cutting edge technologies. So by kind of linking up with people who are doing things that follow your ethos, you are going to shift the way people consume things, because those are the ingredients you're going to be using, and you have that opportunity to kind of educate your consumers on why you're doing that. I think that one of the important things to mention is that farmers globally are impacted by our food decisions on a daily basis. And so eliminating certain things out of the food system doesn't necessarily mean that's a kind of net positive for everybody. And so because it's a global system, we do need to think about how skills are used to evaluate how global our impact is. And as chefs who are trained in doing this, then again, you're shifting some of those benefits onto the consumer. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I just want to mention really quick before I do that, the one culinary academy in Al Khobar that is doing an amazing job in doing this. So Zadig Culinary Academy is a not-for-profit academy who is incorporating sustainability skills, and their ideals are built on the idea of zero waste, seasonality, and local consumption. And so these are some very interesting things that we can start incorporating into the way we think. And it's, there are some budding chefs within the kingdom that are already on this pathway. I think that that's a very kind of positive thing that I wanted to leave this discussion with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for sort of ending on that sort of positive note as well. And our final speaker, last but not least, is Dr. Aisha.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mark, and thanks also for the KFCRIS for organizing this webinar. It is my pleasure to be sharing the knowledge today with the esteemed panelists, and I would like to welcome the audience who are joining us today as well. Before delving into the sustainability of transport sector in the GCC, I would like to start by giving a brief picture of the global transport sector from a global level, and then I would like also to explain what do we mean by sustainable transport system. So according to the BP and EIA, the transport sector is the second largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions and accounting for 21% of total energy use. And with that in mind, the IPCC report and other climate science studies suggest that it is inevitable to involve the transport sector in cutting greenhouse gas emissions if we want to keep the global warming at safe levels, so we can keep it below 2 degrees or more ambitiously to the threshold of 1.5 degrees. In recognition of the importance of the transport sector in tackling the climate change and its role in cutting the greenhouse gas emissions in the sector, as well as the importance of the transport sector to serve the function of modern society and support growing economy, many countries around the world and regions around the world have adopted or developed efficient transport systems, or what we call sustainable transport systems. But what do we mean by sustainable transport system? So digging in the literature, there are many definitions of what we mean by the sustainable transport system, but looking at most of them, they mostly emphasize on the idea that Sustainable transport system is the system that is developed to serve social and economic needs without jeopardizing the natural environment. And to give one specific example, I'm going to give the definition of the EU Council of Ministers of Transport, which defines a sustainable transport system as the one that first allows the basic access and development needs of individuals, companies, and society to be met in a safely and manner and in consistency with the human and ecosystem health, the one that promotes equity within and between successive generations. And secondly, it is the one that is affordable, operates fairly and efficiently, offers a choice of transport mode. And third, it's the one that limits emissions and waste within the planet ability to absorb them. And it uses renewable resources or non-renewable resources, but making sure it's minimizing the impact on the use of land and the generation of noise. Now, if we keep this definition in mind, of course, there are many definitions and approaches that have been adopted like by many other countries like the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth. But going back to the Gulf Arab states, so the Gulf Arab states have indeed made a dramatic progress in developing their transportation infrastructure, especially due to the wealth that have been generated from the oil exports. And that has happened. Many people from the region would be familiar with the transport infrastructure, which links the rural and urban areas, enables trading and allowing access to markets and services. However, and with the exception of Dubai, and actually looking at the literature, I was trying to find a definition of what do we mean by sustainable transport system in the GCC. Unfortunately, and also as Rawan have been trying to find out a definition of what we mean by sustainable fashion that fits with the context of the GCC. Also for the transport sector, with exception of Dubai, I haven't found any definition or vision for how a sustainable transport system should look like in the region. And because of the lack of the vision or the definition of sustainable transport system, today's GCC transport sector and transport policies are mainly focused on developing and upgrading highways and roads rather than focusing or investing in mass public transport. And anyone in the region would be familiar with an ongoing pattern or feedback loop that keeps happening in the region in terms of how the transport infrastructure has been developed in the region. And I would like to point out to that. It is very simple and anyone can observe it. So in the GCC, what we can see is there is a rapid population growth. There is a rapid urbanization, and that keeps putting pressure over the transport network, especially in the cities. And that results in, I think everyone is familiar with high traffic volumes and congestion across the region. And to reduce that kind of a pressure, the policy responses have been focused on upgrading and expanding road networks, which continue to encourage further the urbanization and personal use of cars, or what we call the centric use of like the car-centric culture, and that again leads to further or additional traffic volumes and congestion and so on and so forth. So we have a costly and negative feedback loop here. And because of that, and without immediate or proper governmental intervention, I think we can say, and reflecting on the definition that for sustainable transport system that I have gave at the beginning, I think we can say that the transport sector in the region is far from being efficient or sustainable. And that is, given the negative feedback loop that have been seeing, that has many implications that make the transport sector unsustainable as it is today. And again, with the exception of Dubai. And that's because, first of all, there is a lack of multimodal network. So in the GCC, we don't have this multimodal network, which enables accommodating different types of transport, such as not only cars or buses, but metros, bicycles, and also that enables the commuting of pedestrians. And because of that, unfortunately, the current transport sector as it is amplifies the inequality issue. So there are groups of low-income people in the region who cannot afford having car. So, because of the car-centric culture, not everyone, because of the current structure of the transport system, not everyone can access the transport. And secondly, the current transport or the current design of urban areas and transport architecture do not encourage physical activity. Now, in the GCC, nearly 60 to 100% of population are living in cities or urban areas. And also, the statistics shows that half of the GCC adults are overweight or obese. So with that, with enabling transport infrastructure that encourage walking, exercising, cycling, that could also help in reducing non-communicable health disease. The third thing is there is air pollution. Now, there's a growth in the transportation, and then also along with the expansion of the energy-intensive industry, rapid urbanization, expansion of desalination units. All of these are reliant on, the fossil fuels for their operation, and this lead to deteriorating the air quality across the GCC. And fourth, the climate change effect on the transport sector. So the transport sector in the GCC is not ready and is vulnerable to the climate-related issues, such as extreme weather events like the intense rainfall. And I guess many people who live in the region are familiar with the times when we have intense rainfalls and like there is flooding everywhere, or and because there is no drainage system for the rainwater. And lastly, I would like to end up with touching on the question of whether COVID-19, and this is the focus of today's discussion, whether the COVID-19 confinement measure will trigger the GCC to take off in developing or adopting the sustainability in the transport sector. So from a global perspective, we all know that the COVID-19 confinement measures such as working from home or stay home have led to a global decline in the use of both private and public transport, and that led to a decline in the use of the fossil fuels and a historic decline in global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the GCC is no exception. We have seen that the Gulf countries have implemented lockdown measures which put restrictions on the transport sector. And one of the interesting observations, and these are data from Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, it shows that COVID-19 restriction imposed on transport sector have led to a 30% decline in nitrogen dioxide emissions across the GCC compared to what we have last year. What is more, the COVID-19 lockdown measures across the GCC have unprecedentedly boosted the use of digital economy to enable remote working, running economic activity, and today, for example, having the meeting through Zooms. This has proved that, especially for small, medium enterprises that would, with a solid technological infrastructure, these have been more resilient to such an economic and health shock than any other kind of that doesn't have the solid technological infrastructure. So with this in mind, the question that remains is, will these forced changes in behavior that have been brought by the COVID-19 lockdown will be taken forward after COVID-19, both at individual, business, and governmental levels? So I close with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for closing with what is probably the most important question, which we'll probably come back to in a second. Thank you, everybody, for the various questions that you've put. And I see as well, there's been sort of an ongoing chat about some of this as well in the chat box amongst you, which is very interesting. We don't have a sort of a great deal of time left, but looking at the questions that you've sent in and the questions that I've been thinking about whilst listening to all of the presentations, it seems to me that there are certain things that actually tie them all together. And I think one of probably the most important one goes back to education and how, I mean, we can talk about sort of optimal solutions. We can talk about, what we should be doing or should not be doing, etc. But how do you actually get to a point where you actually start to make these changes norms, if you like? And I would would give just a quick example of this from sort of the classes that I used to teach at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, and we used to have a course on globalization, and part of that we used to teach about environmental issues. And when we were talking about that, and I was talking about recycling, the answer I would get back from my students, who were, of course, sort of in their early 20s, was, well, oh, it's okay for you, in the UK or in Germany, when we go to Germany or France or wherever, we see recycling everywhere. You do this. But I would point out to them and I would say, yes, but when I was your age in the UK, everything went into the same dustbin. Everything. Now, that just shows you what has happened in the course of my lifetime. And it obviously has to do with education, with educating people to realize that actually they, as individuals, as families, as communities, are actually going to benefit if they actually start to use these, to practice this. But how? My question to you, I suppose all of you, is, and this actually links to a lot of the questions that have been asked by the audience, is where do you start in the GCC now, in the GCC states? At what stage in the education system do you actually start to introduce this? Hannah, I just saw you. Yeah, this is an open question, so please feel free to answer. Hannah?
I just think that one of the issues that we have is our starting point when thinking about education, especially today, tends to be an economic one, and really looking at what are the skills we need for the future? How are we going to get these people jobs? And I think that if we can take a step back and stop only linking education to the economy and thinking about the other benefits of education, then that is then it would definitely need to start at every level. But I think it would also be about those human capabilities that we need to instill within people, and values and things that you can then use on your own accord to find jobs in a thriving economy. But regulation, I think, is really important. So as you were saying, with everything went into the same dustbin, if there isn't regulation and there aren't facilities for recycling as well. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for investment in this area of, making it available. But so when you do educate people, then they have, my experience growing up in the Eastern provinces, there's always a really big push for recycling with the Aramco program, and specifically with delivering bins to the neighborhoods surrounding Aramco, as well as inside the camp. But where this went and how much of it actually got recycled was questionable. And so I think that, making sure that there are investments in that space that go hand in hand with that kind of community education and skills education and just general education is really important.
Thanks, Hannah. I mean that also, Rowan, yes, and then into the first Rowan, then into Sa, yes, Rowan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Hannah said. I completely agree. I think it's the system and the planning and policy on top of education. But for education specifically, there's a few studies that I came across recently which were super interesting that show that being able to solve problems and find sustainability solutions have been linked to imagination and pushing imagination in curriculums. And I think this is important because a lot of times we think of sustainability as a technical problem. So it's something that we're trying to solve technically. It's very STEM related, it's an engineering problem. And my background was actually in engineering before, I started the PhD program. And so it's interesting to see that shift where there's a lot of solutions coming from more imaginative disciplines, the arts. It's why fashion sustainability is also such a big topic, because a lot of people that work in fashion are artists and designers that are not necessarily engineers or from STEM. And I think this is really important to add a little bit of imagination, even playfulness in our curriculums, because if you teach children how to be imaginative and playful with the way that they think, I think this is what creates adults that are really able to push the boundaries and think outside of the box as well.
Intisar?
Yes, I agree with Rowan and Hannah, and I think what Rowan was saying is very interesting, perhaps through even storytelling at a very young age. It's the home and how children are raised, and also how they're educated in school. But I think it's a holistic approach. I think there should be awareness campaigns plus policy plus regulation, and it should be encompassing a holistic approach. I don't think one approach is effective without the other.
Aisha?
Well, thank you very much. So in terms of transport, I think we can start from both an individual level, and also we can target the government, because we need regulations out there to promote for the sustainability of the transport. So at the individual level, one of the major issues that we face here in the Gulf region is the traffic fatalities are very high here in the region. And I think we can start from the training programs before the people go into the street. So we could integrate actually the sustainability out there. The first thing is how to drive safely. I think this is something that needs to be taught very intensely here. And this is part of sustainability, really. And then also in terms of the impact of the environment, maybe we can integrate something about the regulations that, for example, the emissions or the standards that the government could put on vehicles in terms of how polluting are they. And then we can also have like the awareness programs that target the government level, so we can enhance further the other dimensions of transport sustainability in the region.
Thank you, Aisha. The other sort of point that it came up in some of the questions in the chat as well, and it was picked up on by a couple of you in your presentations, but I think is also incredibly important, is the one of packaging. It seems, I mean, that's something it's something of a bête noire for me. I mean, it seems that even if I buy something that says is sustainable or organic or whatever, you know, I still have to get through a mountain of packaging to get to it. And a really classic example that I've just had the last couple of weeks was that I was staying in a hotel here in Riyadh, and they actually had a breakfast buffet. Although, of course, because of COVID, you know, sort of buffets have sort of no longer allowed. But they got round this by everything being individually packaged. Now, which is one way of doing it, I suppose. But I mean, it seems to me that the waste of packaging in all sectors is still something that we haven't really tackled at all. I mean, just when you look at your supermarket shop, would anybody like to say anything about this? Rowan? Anna?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit towards packaging, and also, I mean, very much linked with fashion as well. Again, the example of the UK, I mean, even when we look beyond fashion and retail, it's become very normal to, for example, carry your own bag. And it's because, you know, bags are now charged for. And I think this has to do, again, with regulation, but also, you know, I feel like without regulation and the frameworks of, you know, basically, you know, deterring people and disincentivizing them from basically overusing packaging when it's not needed, it's hard to sort of get people to make that happen by themselves, and it becomes very much this individual choice. That being said, some of the most successful campaigns across Europe have been with individuals taking action, pledges, and really running campaigns. You know, the whole, you know, banning, you know, or free plastic paper bags, this came as a result of a lot of campaigning locally. So I think this is one area where activism can actually really work, and campaigning for these kinds of things. And even in the things that, you know, the bags we go buy things with, the way things are individually packaged, I really think it's also, and this is one of the areas where we're not lacking materially. This is very specific, but, you know, we have palm leaves that across the entire Gulf that make really good type parchment or pouches, and there's a lot of local innovations and materials that could actually make up for packaging. I think the issue becomes more complex with the global supply chain, and when you're importing en masse or shipping, and you basically get large amounts of plastics and things that are not easily recyclable. So I think there it's a mixture definitely of activism where that could work, but also, again, regulations, and, you know, really across some of these, all of our Gulf countries, you know, looking at the benefit from having regulation when it comes to things that sit in landfill for a long time. And, you know, I'm sure, you know, my co-panelists as well are familiar with this as well, but the issue with some packaging like plastic isn't only recycling or not recycling, it's also that basically when these sit in landfill, they also can emit, as they disintegrate, they can emit gases that contribute to global warming because they're greenhouse gases. So we don't think of plastic as something that has, you know, gas or emissions, but as actually plastic disintegrates, it does contribute to that as well. So definitely a huge problem, and definitely something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you, Ram. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So maybe we can just have one brief final comment from each of you, maybe related to Aisha's last question that she posed when she said, you know, will the sort of the changes or some of the changes that we've seen happen as a result of COVID-19, you know, are they actually going to last? Maybe just a brief comment. Maybe we'll start with Hannah.
Sure. I just want to say that my keyword with packaging is single use, definitely. I mean, that's kind of the thing, and biodegradability. But before I go into that, with packaging, sometimes when you're importing things, actually you're reducing the environmental impact by packaging things so they don't actually rot before you get them. So, and that is sometimes a more environmental way of doing it. So it's a really tricky, big question that we have to ask. And in terms of will COVID change things, I think, you know, there is a silver lining when you look at this pandemic, because we are reevaluating our consumption. And I think that that's the opportunity now for regulations to make more sense to the average consumer. And so if we can, again, launch them hand in hand with more awareness and integrating things into that ecosystem of the education system with regulations, there might be more of an appetite for it at the moment.
Thank you, Hannah. Intisar, final very brief comment.
Yes, I think people are ready for it. I think we are more mindful because of COVID-19. So the ground is fertile for everything that Hannah has been saying and related to regulation and policy and awareness and everything. Again, I'll go back to the holistic approach. We are ready for it. Will it be fast? No. Will it be steady? Yes. It might just be a little bit slow.
Rowan, final brief comment.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that we are ready. I think it's an inflection point. It's a moment for reflection, and there is a certain momentum in society. I think what will be challenging, despite being ready, even if we don't see this coming across governmental priorities quickly, I think the challenge is because, trying to find things that are fit to our society culturally and materially, as opposed to just, you can import the best technology, but that doesn't really solve a lot of problems that are related to the way our cities are built, to the, sort of consumer habits and so forth. So I think that is the next challenge. And I think we are ready. I think there's a lot of people thinking about the same problems. And it comes, going back to stakeholder management from, Hannah's presentation, she was specifically talking about culinary decisions. But if you think about it, we need to really organize, because there is a lot of activism and thinking when it comes to sustainability. It's just about really getting organized, getting those policy passed, getting awareness, as Intisar has been saying, in a very holistic way. So yeah, I think the readiness is there.
Thank you, Rowan. Aisha, sorry for stealing your question, but it was an excellent question. So I think it's only appropriate that we end with you.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it. But for me, I think the lockdown measures and the COVID-19 and the changes in the behavior have proved two things. Well, yes, there was a major impact on the economy on the one hand, but on the other hand, it proved also that there are some environmental gains and also, in a way, some economic gains. Actually, this is not backed with the studies, but it has also, the lockdown measures have proved that working from home or working remotely has been very productive, maybe compared to going to the office. And also for many businesses, they actually saved money from not just going to the office, not using the car to go to the office, or also for some of them, maybe they didn't need to pay the rent for the office building. So there are some economic, social, and environmental gains out there. But I think, and then there are two groups of people who are for example, who supported the remote working, some of the people who prefer to go to the office. But I think what we need to do here is to push further change through doing further research and back that push with the research evidence. And that should be targeted by, education awareness programs that target the governments as well as the individuals. So.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us this evening. And there's a great deal, I think, to think about and a great deal to discuss as obviously we go into the new year and the unpredictability of the new year due to the pandemic. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all again at future King Faisal Centre events, whether via Zoom or hopefully in 2021, some in-person events as well. So thank you very much. Have a good evening and everybody take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark.